I just bought a new iPhone. A brand new high end, like not the best in the market because the 15 just came out, but a relatively recent iPhone that can, I'm sure, run most major games, most applications, most anything on the market. I bought this thing and I think to myself, I never actually got into mobile gaming. Let's get into the lucrative, the highly successful mobile game sphere. Let's look at what Apple has in store for us in this app store. So I look through the app store, I download a couple of games, I play, I try Fire Emblem Heroes, I try, you know, look at stuff, I try looking at like the most successful, most popular games. I look at this garbage and I'm just kind of like, no. And I immediately go back to console gaming. And I think for the vast majority of those of us who play like serious video games, who like understand like the inferiority of mobile, who understand like just what's going on here, like I think that's the general reaction for those of us who are like highly invested in gaming and gamer culture. Like you inherently just play these like low quality garbage like MOBA, like just mobile, just nonsense, and you just have this natural revulsion to it. You just have this sense that like, yeah, I could be playing something better. I could play Mario Kart Tour on my phone, or I could play the real thing on Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, right? Like, why exactly would I play Pokemon Go on my phone when I could play Pokemon Scarlet and Violet on my Switch? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Even in this mindset where like, oh well, sometimes people just want to waste time in public. Well, I'll read a book or I'll look at like my YouTube analytics or I'll do something, right? Like, I'll message friends. Like, there are things that I use phones for, right? I like my phone for what it is, but I've come to realize upon looking at like the games on there, like how useless they are, how overpriced they are, like the garbage controls, like that I will never ever play games on them. And I have to wonder just how much of the community feels the same way because it really does feel like over the past 10 years, we've slowly moved away from this mindset that like Apple was going to drive Nintendo out of the console sphere. Because that was a real concern like 10 years ago that like iPhone was becoming such a dominant force in the gaming sphere that it was ruining the casual gaming market, that Nintendo would have to like be forced to go third party and they would be forced to develop games for phones. And there was all this like talk about like, oh, they were gonna make micro transactions. I've seen like Angry Joe talked about this like as early as late as this year, right? When he was talking about like Fire Emblem Heroes and it making like over $1 billion, like he just goes like, "Oh man, Nintendo's going to do more and more of this stuff." No, they haven't. Like that's the reality is that this stuff is like a decade old at this point. It's not a new thing anymore, and Nintendo has not changed, right? They haven't stopped making their full price games. They haven't stopped producing their hardware. And if anything, I think more people are understanding like the downsides to mobile, how overly monetized everything is, like the poor art, like the over reliance on fan service, like the poor story structure and like the controls and just how much better you're off simply just buying a console than buying an overpriced phone, right? Buying an overpriced tablet. Like if you could buy Resident Evil 4 on remake on like a new iPad or whatever for $60, or you could do it on your PC, or you could do it on your Xbox or PS5. Like, and I think most of the audience are going to go for those alternative methods. Like, I don't think there will really be all that much of a audience for that game on Apple products, right? Like it's just not the kind of thing they're interested in. And there's nothing wrong with that, to be sure. Like I certainly don't have like the disdain for Apple that I do for Xbox, PlayStation, Valve, or like any of these other gaming companies, but like you have to understand that we are at that point now where Nintendo isn't going to be driven out of the console space by anyone, right? Sony tried that and failed. They drove everyone else out of the console space in the 90s, but they never managed it with Nintendo, right? It took Apple inventing like the most innovative, like most universally like adopted piece of technology ever, right? The iPhone, to even like have people even like talking about the possibility. And in the end, they failed as well, right? Like one of the biggest companies in the world completely failed to take Nintendo out of the hardware space. And like I have to ask you, because I keep seeing Raging Golden Eagle bring up like how the consoles are on the way out. Like how exactly are they going to be driven out? Right? Because they are an affordable piece of hardware that are designed specifically to play games. And they do that better and more affordably than the competition. Anyone who says that gaming PCs like are better than consoles are like deluding themselves, because they're like tricking those suckers out. They're getting the highest quality video graphics cards. They're like, you know, getting the hardware that they're like modding like stuff. Like that's not like the real experience of buying and playing a game, right? Like it is a niche thing. PC gaming is a niche thing, right? Nobody wants to admit it, but it is true. Whereas like with Nintendo Switch, it's like streamlined, it's accessible, it's much more affordable. You can just buy the game and put it in your hardware and you're good, right? Like I don't feel as if most people really understand the appeal of Nintendo hardware, of consoles, or whatever. Like they don't really understand that Nintendo is going to continue to innovating, not just with their IPs and new games, but with their hardware. And like I do think in the next 20 years we're going to reach the point where a lot of the stuff they put out is going to be unemulatable. And I think we're already starting to see that with games like Ring Fit Adventure, right? With Star Fox Zero, with like this or that. Like it's gonna get more and more pronounced. Like there's gonna be a more and more of a distinction between what Nintendo is doing and what like Apple and what mobile and what PC is doing. And that Nintendo audience is going to keep growing. It's going to become more and more passionate, and they're going to keep supporting Nintendo, right? They are going to keep buying these games. They're going to keep supporting these games because they're the best in the industry, right? The cope that like people used to have that like mobile would become dominant simply because like everyone has a phone. It's been proven to be like it's just not going to happen at this stage. It's never ever going to happen. And all the cope that people have like thrown at Nintendo over the years, that people will stop supporting them because of like censorship or something, that Sony's going to drive them out, that like Nintendo is seen as a brand for children, that is increasingly becoming like a thing that like nobody actually believes anymore. Anybody who bleats that kind of thing is just a sheep repeating like lines from the 90s, lines of propaganda from the 90s, right? Like Nintendo has like a really dedicated adult fan base. So no longer can you pretend as if the brand is for children. You cannot keep up the illusion anymore. And that in and of itself is going to be a huge blow against the narrative that Sega and then later PlayStation adopted as propaganda against Nintendo, right? Like you can't, like right now, the big thing, holy shit, she's cute. The big thing now, I think, is that uh, where was I? Yeah. Nintendo Nintendo is not going to be driven out of the hardware space, right? People are no longer like disrespecting them openly and like trying to. You can't pretend as if they only have like three franchises worth supporting. Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon was the meme back in the mid 2000s, right? Like people used to say that like, oh, you only buy Nintendo for the first party games, but more and more recently, we're seeing huge successes for like indie games. Stuff like Hollow Knight, stuff like Shovel Knight, stuff like Sifu. Like these are games that do relatively well on Switch. And you are delusional if you believe that like these games cannot run on Nintendo hardware, right? That is like the big meme right now is that like, oh, Switch can't handle these new games. But in reality, there's no that's a complete narrative. It's a lie, right? Like it's crazy how people still repeat that because without that narrative, without that like without that like lie, for the corporations, for like without that lie like justifying like the lack of support for Nintendo hardware, like third parties really don't have a leg to stand on, right? Like they religiously support like PlayStation, Xbox, PC, and Apple, right? Trying to get non-Nintendo hardware to try to take off, trying to keep from Nintendo from controlling the entire industry, trying to do this, trying to destroy Nintendo, and it just is not working whatsoever. And we've been seeing this since the 90s, and like right now, the way I see things going, like Apple and PC aren't going to go anywhere, right? You know that these are big monoliths that it's not going to happen. What I think is going to happen is that like we're gonna see these big brand names that are attached to these. You know, Capcom, Square Enix, Sega, Take Two, Rovia. Well, Rovia was just acquired by Sega, but like you know, we're gonna see these big brand names, right? You know, the big third parties we call them. You know, Ubisoft, right? Activision Blizzard, well, they just got acquired by Microsoft, but like we're gonna see the big brand names, you know, everything controlled by PlayStation and Xbox. We're gonna see these companies just wither up and die. They're gonna die a slow and painful death for because of just how they handle themselves, how they conduct themselves, and how they sell their products to their audience, right? They will not be able to succeed in the new era. And we are beginning to see like the beginnings of that now. Actually, the beginnings of that was 10 years ago. We're in the middle of like the declines of these companies, right? We're seeing games like Final Fantasy 16 bomb. We're seeing like Sega's massive quadruple A product like Hyenas just completely bomb, you know, in the beta and get canceled for doing so poorly. Like we're seeing like Overwatch go from one of the most overhyped things in existence to one of the worst games that like to the laughing stock of the industry, right? Like these companies cannot compete with what Nintendo is doing, right? And we are going to see them slowly get choked out and stomped into irrelevancy. And Apple is going to continue to exist, right? They're going to keep putting out phones, they're going to keep doing their thing, but like I think it's going to become more and more obvious, even to like the most casual of casual gamers, just how much better Nintendo is. Like it's crazy how like you see younger people like wearing Nintendo properties these days. You know, like like you're seeing gamer stuff in public a lot more, and it's always like Nintendo stuff. You never see like PlayStation mascots or anything. It's always like Nintendo specifically. Like you're seeing like younger generations, those of us who are passionate about video games, like we're all gonna be fans of Nintendo. Nobody remembers Halo. Nobody remembers like Quake or Doom. Nobody remembers like all the stuff of yesteryear that like the industry likes to prop up as like examples of franchises that could have killed Nintendo. You know, Ultima. Like Ultima, I don't even think is available on modern platforms. You know, like the series that inspired Dragon Quest is not available publicly. It's so crazy to think about. But like, you know, you have these crazy games like, you know, from 20, 30, 40 years ago that are supposed to be the biggest thing in the world. And 10 years from now, they're going to be completely forgotten. You know, is anybody even going to remember that Baldur's Gate 3 came out this year, like 10 years from now? I don't. Like, you can tell now that, like, nobody remembers Dragon Age Inquisition. And 10 years ago, that was the edgy, like, woke, like, sexualized, like, D&D, like, art, like, RPG thing. Like, you know, same exact thing. It was, like, lauded by critics. It was hyped as, like, the best game of the year. It won Game of the Year 2014, and yet nobody remembers it even nobody even remembered it like the following year, right? That's the kind of situation we're in. Like gamers, you know, serious gamers, they'll go back and they'll play classics from like 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. They're not wasting their time with these garbage mobile games that are just time wasters, right? More and more, I think gamers will respect Nintendo and reject the competition, no matter what it is or what it looks like or who the demographics are. It is obviously inferior to Nintendo in the eyes of gamers everywhere.